Chicago on a blistering cold Sunday morning, I had a chance to talk to Steve Ryfle and Ed Godziszewski during a screening of Jonathan Bell's documentary Ishiro Honda, Memoirs of a Film Director. Brought to you by the Chicago Japan Film Collective, founded by the Emmy Award-winning Yuki Sakamoto Solomon. Ed and Steve, thank you for being here.
Thank you for doing this, and thank you for being here, everybody. Appreciate it.
Thanks for coming on such a challenging day.
I know it's but I did a little video. I said, it's in Chicago. It gets cold, and when you come out on a day like this, it just makes it all the more memorable because you braved the harsh winter. Not a Godzilla monster, but still harsh winter nonetheless. So, Ed and Steve, I got to ask you collectively, what is it that fascinated you so much about this director, Honda-san, and why did you decide to take so much of your life writing books about this? What was it that did it for you?
Well, I think both of us grew up watching these movies, and they had a great influence on our imagination. And I always wanted to know more about the people who made them. These names would scroll across the screen, and as a child, I was just struggling to pronounce them. But you also wondered, who were these people? And there was very, very little information available. And I always tell this story when people ask me, why did you want to write about this stuff? When I was in elementary school, I went to a bookstore in my neighborhood, or the local bookstore, and I asked if they had any books about Godzilla. And the guy behind the counter said, "Why would you want to read a book about that? Those films are terrible." And I totally disagreed, and I kept looking for books over time. And, at one point in my life, I just decided, well, there isn't one, so maybe I'll try to write one. And it starts you on this long journey, and it's a wonderful... you're right. I mean, both of us have dedicated a fair amount of our lives to this passion project that has, grown into something really wonderful for both of us together and individually. And so there was a moment where we were both together in Japan working on a documentary film about the special effects behind these types of pictures. And we, by sort of happenstance, met Ryuji Honda, the son of Ishiro Honda, who's in this film. And he is the one who actually raised the idea of writing a biography about his father. And that's how it all started as far as our involvement with Honda's story.
Yeah, it's amazing that we had, as we were in Japan working on this documentary film, just by chance we had been talking about, well, what are we going to do next after this? And one of the ideas we had was to write, to do something about the life of Honda. So the fact that we wound up meeting Honda's son just shortly thereafter, and he was the one who raised the idea. He says, "Do you know anybody who would want to write a biography of my father?" Because he was concerned that all the biographies and things that were written about Honda in Japan, most of those were all written from exactly the same viewpoint. He wanted to get some kind of different viewpoint on how his father's work was viewed. So it was kind of a very much good timing on all of our parts that we wound up meeting him at that time.
And I think our purpose in wanting to write a biography of Honda was similar to Jonathan's purpose in making this film. I think he states it, I can't remember if it's in the film itself or in the little introduction that he recorded, but people know Godzilla, but they don't know Godzilla's creator. And in our case, it was similarly, people know Godzilla, they don't know the man behind all of these films, and they really don't know. We knew that just sort of superficially that he had this entire other career that basically precedes the period in which he becomes exclusively, essentially, a science fiction director. And we wanted to know more about that. We wanted to try to introduce him as a filmmaker and explore that part of his life and his career that we really didn't know very much about at that time. And so our purpose was very similar. And I'm glad that the film, I think, I'm happy and proud to say, because our role in this film is really more, not just appearing in it, it was more of an advisory role. He kind of, I think, used our book as a launching off point. But the thing that I love about this film and what it contributes is that he actually went to Honda's birthplace, and he actually shows that period of Honda's life in very rich detail in a rich way. I really appreciate that he our book and the film are kind of companion pieces, and they complement one another in really nice ways.
So when I first experienced this watching Godzilla movies, so it's like getting back to Svengoolie, and it's funny trying to explain Svengoolie to people who didn't grow up in Chicago. It's a fascinating conversation, but I think every city has its sort of like gothic weirdo who like shows these old movies. But obviously and we'll get into it in a second. The movies that are shown with the bad overdubs and the sort of campiness to it, because obviously it had been like 20 years since these films had come out. I always just was very entertained by them. But as a young man, I was like 6, 7 years old. The pathos and the sorrow that obviously that these films are the foundation of these films that are established on didn't quite resonate with me until I was a little bit older. Was it the same for you, or did you, your experiences, did you see firsthand like, oh, there's a lot more deeper story to this than what they're showing on these creature features?
Well, one thing I like to talk about is, since you bring that up, is the although maybe the themes were a little bit simplistic, they were definitely there in his films, and especially when I was growing up, I'm a kid from the late 50s, early 60s, and things like Battle in Outer Space, for example. Here you have, the world is coming together, and you got all the different nations of the world are trying to contribute to the effort to defend the Earth, and even the Russians are in there. And I'm growing up in the time when I'm watching on TV, like here's Khrushchev knocking his shoe on the podium saying, "We will bury you." The immediacy of the Cold War era idea that we were just a step away from nuclear war. That really was something that I, as a little kid, really felt very, very much so. And then to see these kind of films, which take a little bit of the opposite attitude, like, oh, well, cooperation between the countries, even with Russia, who was considered as the evil enemy at that time, that was what he was promoting. And I think that kind of thing really made a big impression on me as, like maybe a 10-year-old kid at that time.
And to your point, the unintentional comedy that was experienced by the audience, that is owed a lot to the way these films were treated when they were imported to the United States. Dubbing it's an impossible task to get right. It's going to have, it's fraught with challenges, put it that way. And you're removing the original performance of the actors, you're replacing it with something else. Oftentimes the people who were dubbing these films were the same crews of actors that were dubbing cartoons at the same time, and they were taking a very similar approach. So you're removing the performance of the actors. Also, the films were also re-edited much of the time. I think the classic case is the very first Godzilla film. We see footage from the trailer of it, but that film was drastically recut and went for an American audience and given an American perspective by shoehorning an American actor into the story.
Raymond Burr, right?
Right, and it completely kind of changes the point of view of the picture. It's both a blessing and a curse, because it allowed that film to be mass marketed in a way that it wouldn't have been possible otherwise. You wouldn't have been able to distribute that as a purely dubbed or even a subtitled film at that time. So, the original Godzilla film, some people consider it a bastardization the way it was released here, but it also kind of paved the way for what we're doing today. It opened the door for Honda's films and all kinds of, Japanese popular culture to be exported to the West over the next few decades.
It's obvious from the documentary that the war, severely impacted his life, as it did so many people. My grandparents were in World War II as well. My grandmother grew up in the Philippines, and my grandfather was, fighting his way through to getting to the Philippines to meet her. He had no idea, but it happened that way. So when you think about like Kurosawa, and I know even like Mifune, there's a wonderful documentary about him too, the actor, the post-traumatic stress that they felt. Obviously, in some ways, these films that he created was a way to deal with it. I know it's a lot, but can you talk a little bit more about just how much that the Pacific War, World War II, affected Honda and the films that he made after the war?
That's a huge
I
topic.
know. We're going.
But
yeah.
just on a
Sorry about that.
no, just on a, as far as his career trajectory, it basically once he got out of the service, he was what, about 35-ish, I guess he would have been. Well, the country itself and the film industry more specifically was devastated, and so he did return to Toho. There's a story in our book that I think is quite dramatic about him. When he came home, he was quite ill, but when he recovered, he was determined, as he states. One of the other lovely things about this movie is that we have recordings of his voice and we get to hear him tell parts of his story. But he ended up going back to the studio, showing up at the gate, and they didn't even recognize him. He had been basically gone for so long. But he re-enters the film industry. But in the second half of the 40s, the studio was basically in shambles and in a disarray, and there were very, very few films being made. And so he had to kind of restart his career as an assistant director again, whereas Kurosawa had already graduated and become a filmmaker in his own right, and so many of his colleagues had. And because there were so few films being made at that period of time, it was very difficult for him to rise through the ranks. So he doesn't actually become a feature film director until 1951, and he was already 40 years old approximately. So just from a practical standpoint, it derailed his life and his career. But as we talk about it's mentioned that he had these recurring nightmares. That's the PTSD part of it, right? He suffered from those nightmares through the rest of his life, and that's one of the reasons I think Stuart's talking about in the later part of the documentary about. There's this assumption that the tunnel sequence from Kurosawa's dreams was written by or directed by Honda, because there's a great deal of similarity between that story in Kurosawa's film and Honda's nightmare. If you hear Kimi retell, the description of Honda's nightmares of seeing his dead, fellow soldiers all standing in a line, and that sequence, if you've seen the film, is very much like that. So we don't have strong evidence to suggest that he actually wrote or directed that, but he's clearly had a strong influence on that, and I think that represents this aspect of his life that you're talking about, this PTSD that he was experiencing and expressing all through his life and his career.
It's fascinating. Oh, did you want to add something?
Yeah, well, I don't think that necessarily that comes through, other than perhaps the war films that he made, like Eagle of the Pacific and Farewell Rabaul. Maybe some of his nightmares of the war experience come through in the way he portrays those films. But just the end result of those nightmares is that his films projected the idea of international cooperation and peace between people. He was very much someone who was interested in that kind of idea, and it came through in many of his films, especially the science fiction films. So I don't think the trauma itself came through in his films. It's just what the trauma propelled him to do, which was to present the ideas of a better world.
And I think in some of his science fiction and fantasy films, you can interpret the antagonist as being representative of Imperial Japan in films like The Mysterians, especially in Atragon. We have this undersea kingdom that basically is trying to colonize the surface world. And there's a lot of allegory and a lot of real relationship between these fictional stories, what we perceive over here when they're imported to the United States, and a lot of this context and subtext doesn't translate very well. But in Japan, I think some of these allegories were quite clear.
He also has a lot of strong female characters. And how much of that do you think is based on his wife, because she was obviously a very strong and determined person, but also to the experiences that he had during the war and seeing some of the trauma that had occurred with women in China and Korea?
Well, I'm glad you brought this up. I think it's good that the documentary doesn't skirt around the issue of the comfort women and his work in the comfort station. And I think you bring it up in the documentary, this idea there's this outrage industry online, and that's where I think that some of this discussion comes up, where people, behind their keyboards are, convicting Honda of war crimes, which is really the issue of the comfort women is tragic, and it's a stain on Japan's war legacy like no other, I think. But it's also something, if you look at I liken it to the way slavery has been discussed, and the way the discussion around slavery has evolved in our country over time. It took something like Roots to really kind of change the dialogue. Up until then, to really express and understand or begin to understand the tragic nature and the brutality and the horrific crime of slavery. Up until that point, we had, Gone with the Wind and Song of the South, in popular culture. And I think that there's been this slow evolution, maybe even much slower, around the issue of the comfort women in Japan, because we still have, we have Korean American communities in the United States that want to erect, tributes to the comfort women that were lost. And whenever that happens in the United States, you have protests coming over from Japan, largely this protest. We had a situation in my community around this a couple of years ago. So it's still something that's sort of this taboo subject. And yet Honda, as we say in the documentary, in 1965 or 66, wrote this sort of first-person piece about his experiences, which I think was really, I'd use the word brave on his part, because it was, again, something that wasn't, still to a large part, isn't discussed terribly openly in the public forum. So that, I think, yes, I do think that had a large impact on his characterizations of women. In fact, there's and mostly in the films that you don't see in this country, the dramatic films that he made in the 50s and the comedies, he has great, wonderful female characters. But even in his science fiction films, largely the decisive action is taken by a female character. In the first Godzilla, it's Emiko who has to make this really horrible decision to betray her fiance, Serizawa, her former fiance, to basically break a promise because she knows it's the only way to save the world, right? And then there's another character in a film, even a lighthearted film like Invasion of Astro Monster, which is the one with the aliens with the wraparound sunglasses from the mid-60s. It's a female character that basically sacrifices herself to save the world.
I think, I always go back to my grandmother, who was born in Cebu, the Philippines, who grew up in Manila, and obviously was, somebody who had experienced World War II firsthand. And when asked about it, she always would say, well, war makes anybody do terrible things. You don't have to be Japanese, American, Filipino, whatnot. It's just the unfortunate circumstances of being around in that time period. And we all just do the best we can. And that being said, I noticed, when you hear about Kurosawa and Mifune, many of the artists and poets that came out after World War II, part of why I think what made them so great was just they were dealing with these emotions head on and channeling it into their artwork and their ways of looking at the world.
Well, Godzilla in particular is not, it doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's part of this larger catharsis through art and through culture that's been going on in Japan ever since the war. That includes anime, it includes film, it includes art and literature. And it's a really complex processing of that experience. And Godzilla is just one small part of it, but it's the one that we're more familiar with because it's so global.
Right. One of my favorite books is a book called From Postwar to Postmodern, 1945-1989. It was put out by MoMA, where they literally just translated all these different essays and stories about the Japanese art scene in the later half of the 20th century. And it's a fascinating read because you can see, especially in the years right after the war, and that Japan and the artists were dealing with the identity. What would Japan be? Are we becoming too Western? Are we becoming too, traditional? Should we run away from these traditions because it got us into trouble? Do you think that Honda also was dealing with some of these more existential issues as well?
Oh, well, yeah, especially if you are fortunate enough to see some of his drama films, things that he'd done in the 50s, that there's a lot of themes that he portrays about tradition versus, breaking away from that and modernizing. And any number of the drama films deal with that particular issue, and he's always pretty much kind of promoting the breaking from tradition and basically letting people express themselves or get freedom. I mean, Good Luck to These Two is a perfect example of that. It's almost in some ways autobiographical because it's the struggles of this young couple whose the woman's parents are very much against their wedding, and so they wind up having to struggle on their own and find themselves in a world where they're really expected to act in a certain way.
Yeah, I mean, the influence of Western culture is a major theme in post-war Japanese cinema. You see it in Ozu, you see it in all the major directors, and it pops up occasionally in Honda's science fiction films, although it's not a major theme. And then you see little pieces of evidence of that from, I think it's in Fumiko's apartment in King Kong versus Godzilla. She has like jazz records, American jazz records on the wall, things like that.
It's funny because like a lot of people forget like those two, Godzilla and King Kong were hooking up even before they started doing it now in the Monarch series.
That's true.
Which I don't understand. Why does Godzilla have like an Apple Watch? I don't know what's happening here. Like I think it's gotten a little off the rails. But that being said, I have also noticed that the sort of the original themes of Godzilla have resurfaced within the last few years. If you look at like Godzilla -1, or you look at the Monarch series, they're directly addressing many of the issues that the original Godzilla addressed. Do you think Honda would be happy, or be disappointed that we have to redress this again?
I think those films, those themes never went away. The danger never went away. I mean, as we talk about in the documentary, that speech that Yamane gives at the end of the first film is it's a warning, because the first film it's a cautionary tale, and here we are 7 years later, and that warning hasn't been heeded. And we were again. People, our president, other world leaders are talking about blowing up the world. So we're instead of stepping back from the precipice, we're even closer to it.
Yeah, I think, would Honda be happy that's? I think he'd be pleased that this message continues to be put out there. I mean, go back to early 2000s when Shusuke Kaneko made GMK. And that was like completely the point of Godzilla at that time, is that the modern world and people in the modern world are kind of forgetting the idea that this is still a big problem, and the war has caused us a lot of grief, and now that people are kind of forgetting that, that's why what actually prompts Godzilla to reappear, that to kind of remind people that war is a horrible thing, and to just disregard it and forget about it is not something we should ever do.
I think I was just going to add that I think one of the reasons that Godzilla can continue to be so popular, other than the fact that it's marketed to the hilt these days, but that Honda in the original film left a tiny bit of ambiguity there that future filmmakers have been able to it gives them leeway to reinterpret the monster for the current context. The ambiguity is in the fact that, yes, Godzilla is said to have been reawakened by an American hydrogen bomb test, but there's also the legend of Odo Island. And so it's never entirely clear whether Godzilla is a mythological creature or a scientific aberration, or a little of both. And so like in Kaneko's film that Ed just mentioned, and Shin Godzilla and Godzilla -1, they're all in their own way faithful to the original, but they also put their own spin on it for the modern times based on things that are going on in the world today.
The old dean of the college I went to way back in the day said that I took a science fiction and horror film seminar class, and what was so fascinating is one of my favorite classes I ever took in college, because what you realize is that science fiction and horror films, they are basically a reflection of the worries and the thoughts and concerns of the people of that time. Even if it's a film set in the future, it's still a funhouse mirror reflection of like, okay, how are we dealing with a lot of these sort of existential crises? going to a technical standpoint, obviously these films, by the time I saw them in the early 80s, were dated, but there was some real technical superiority that was happening in terms of how they crafted these films, how they made these films. What do you think were the most significant advances that Honda, especially in those early Godzilla films, was able to bring to cinema?
Well, yeah, unfortunately, I have to say it's what Honda was able to bring was the story to life, but as far as the technical aspects, he had not really that much to do with it, other than to have a very understanding approach to the incorporation effects into his film. He had what, by all accounts, is a very unique relationship with Eiji Tsuburaya, the director of special effects, the guy who created Godzilla pretty much from scratch. And they had the kind of relationship where they understood that both sides of the house, both the drama and the special effects, needed each other. And that was an important thing. Not everybody could get along with Tsuburaya, and the fact that those two you hear the story that they could finish each other's sentences, that they were that much in tune with each other that they could understand what each side needed. And the fact that they were able to do that is something that allowed these films to be made in a way that probably they could not be with any other directors.
I think just taking it seriously is something that's just way ahead of its time. Because you think about Stanley Kubrick does 2001 in 1968. And that was when we started to say, okay, maybe we can make special effects. We can actually make it an integral part of the story and not make it this sort of Buck Rogers sort of fantasy. And then of course Star Wars in 1977, where you can do a fun story, but still using special effects to tell that story and not doing it in sort of a campy way. So I think in some ways, maybe he was really ahead of the curve at that time. His relationship with Kurosawa is fascinating too, because I think was it 54 when both Seven Samurai and Godzilla were up for Best Picture, and Seven Samurai wins. I mean, it's Seven Samurai. It's good. It's sort of like the Pulp Fiction and Forrest Gump going up for Best Picture. I mean, technically it can go to either or, but it's always going to be the more prestige picture that gets the award. How significant do you think that was, that the fact that both Godzilla and Seven Samurai come out in the same year, and do you think that significantly changed the direction of Japanese cinema?
Well, that was kind of a period when the Japanese movie industry was really rebounding from all that devastation that had occurred and deprivation after the war. Toho almost was shut down by a series of strikes. During the occupation, labor unions were given a great deal of power that they hadn't had before, and one of the trade-offs of that was a series of labor unrests. And Toho nearly folded. So it took a number of years before production really started up again. But what happened was around the time that the occupation ended, Mr. Kobayashi, who was the founder and head of Toho, decided to invest a great deal of money into a small number of prestige pictures, and to basically revive the studio and return it to its what he perceived its rightful place at the top of the industry. And Godzilla and Seven Samurai were two of those pictures. And that was 1954 was essentially a banner year for Toho and for the industry. And it was the start of the resurgence of Japanese cinema on a commercial scale, and also internationally with films of like Rashomon winning the prize at Venice and kind of making a name for Japanese cinema around the world. But by the end of the 50s, there was a brief period of time where the Japanese film industry was so successful and productive that Japan actually made more films than Hollywood did for a very brief period of time. But as I think it's talked about very briefly again in the documentary, the rise of television. Television, of course, when it was first introduced in Japan, was sort of a luxury item, or an item that not everyone could afford. But by the 60s, televisions were becoming more affordable. And of course, everybody bought them to watch the Olympics and the royal wedding a few years before that. And that was one of the things that brought about the sort of slow downfall of cinema, or the movie industry in Japan, and with it, this type of film, which was, again, pretty expensive. I think I love the quote. I think it's in the movie. Honda and Tsuburaya were too expensive, and so their livelihood sort of fell off.
We see this happen in America too, right? I think part of why America was able to sort of weather the storm a little bit more was because we then, in like with the late 60s, I think it was 68 as well, like we got rid of the code.
Mm-hmm.
So we were allowed to do much more like, racy, exploitative films that we couldn't have done before, which you wouldn't put on television. But obviously Japan was a little bit more open to sort of like more adult programming. So they maybe didn't have that chance to sort of like, because I think in all technologies, there's point and counterpoint, right? We had like, films were in the 4:3 ratio, and then we put them into like the widescreen ratio to compete with the television sets, and so on and so forth. Oh, good. You're going to say
No, but I mean, it's a sort of a parallel, I guess, at the around this time, the late 60s, early 70s, when the industry is kind of cratering, the studios, in order to survive, some of them started to make more exploitative programming, including more nudity and things like that, to try to survive, and it briefly, worked for some of them. But yeah, there's a parallel. Of course, Hollywood also suffered at the hands of television, and a few years later, roughly the same thing happened in Japan. Yeah, and that was all.
No, what we're experiencing it now is, it's like 2025 is the year everyone's like, no one's in the theater.
Right.
So,
right, things change.
Yeah, applaud for yourselves. You showed up at a theater today. Good for you guys, actually. Yeah. If there's something, because we got to wrap up here shortly here, that isn't in the documentary, that might be in your book, about Honda that you would like people to know about, something that hasn't been discussed. Is there any particular thing or any just part of his character or something about him that you would like everyone here to know about today? I know, I'm going for a deep question.
No, that's a good question.
Because we covered so much, so much is covered in the documentary.
Yeah.
I mean, just the fact, maybe just to emphasize it, there's, you meet all sorts of characters in the film business, and generally a lot of them have their flaws. But you think it couldn't be true, but Honda was the kind of person that you never heard anybody have a bad word about him, say a bad word about him. The actors all loved him. That he brought out the best in them without getting angry at them. The studio, liked his work. There's really not a bad word to be said about him. He was really truly the kind of gentleman that his reputation has. He wasn't somebody whose background has been whitewashed.
I would say Honda is part of an aspect of Japanese cinema that is still very much underexplored in the West and in this country, and that is Japanese commercial cinema. Even to this day, the majority of what is exported to the West are the films that either the classics or things that are like Drive My Car, things that are really successful in festivals and things like that, or really, edgy genre stuff that is notable. There's a number of really good genre filmmakers whose work have been even remade here in the United States. But by and large, the era that I was talking about a few minutes ago, this massive commercial success in Japanese cinema during the 50s and 60s, that's an area, even in Japan, a lot of those films are, basically forgotten to a large extent. And I'm encouraged that slowly some of these films start to resurface. Some of them, now that we don't have to, I like physical media, but the fact that you can stream certain things and go directly that route, it opens the door for certain things that maybe you wouldn't have had a chance to see. So the Criterion Channel has screened a lot of Japanese films from that period that I don't think we might have seen otherwise. And Honda's films, the ones that we don't see in this country, and to a large extent not even in Japan anymore, the drama films, the comedies, and the war films, I would hope that that over time maybe there will be a place for those, that maybe some of those can be screened here in some form or fashion. We're changing the way that we watch movies, and so we can distribute them more easily, and I hope that a greater part of his career will be, understood and studied and appreciated.
Yeah, I have to say that one of the greatest pleasures in working on the Honda biography was the fact that we got to, in essence, rediscover one of our favorite filmmakers. We got to rediscover him all over again by seeing all these films which were, are largely unavailable, at least up until this time. And if you have the chance to see any of his other films, I strongly encourage that, because you'll see a side of Honda that maybe you're not aware exists, but that they're really quite enjoyable as a set of films.
I think we're at time. For the video. Ed and Steve, thank you so much for coming out today.
Thank you, Michael.
Great job.
Once again, a special thank you to Facets in Chicago and the Chicago Japan Film Collective, founded by Yuki Sakamoto Solomon. We'll see you again in a couple weeks.